Adriano Leite Ribeiro spent years of his life with a bullet lodged in his skull. He never had it taken out. He lived in Vila, Cruzeiro, a favela on the north side of Rio de Janeiro. He worked, he stayed out of the gangs that ran the hill, and he raised a son who would grow up to be the most physically frightening footballer in Europe. That son was 22 years old when the phone rang. Before that phone call, the boy from Vila Cruzeiro had a name in Italy. The Italians did not call him Adriano. They called him L'Imperatore, the Emperor. Not because he was elegant, because he would take the ball, put his shoulder into a defender, and the defender would stop being a factor in the game. He finished inside the top 10 of the Ballon d'Or in 2 consecutive years. He was named the world's leading goal scorer of 2005. He was 23 years old. And in the summer of 2004, after Adriano dragged Brazil through a Copa América final in Lima with a goal in stoppage time, his national team manager, Carlos Alberto Parreira, stood in front of the press and said something that sounds almost cruel now. He said Adriano would be making history in football. He said Adriano would play in the next 3 World Cups, for sure. Adriano played in 1. He was 24 when he played his last World Cup match. After that, he would win 12 more caps for Brazil in his entire life and make 156 more competitive club appearances. That is not a decline. A decline takes years. This is a career that stops. Here is what makes this story different from every other wasted talent story in football. Adriano was not injured out of the game. He was not sold to the wrong club. He was not exposed as a fraud. The talent never left him, and you will see the proof of that later, when he was overweight, drinking, and still scoring goals that won championships. What happened to Adriano happened in 9 days. 9 days between the best night of his life and the worst one. I want to walk you through those 9 days, and then through what came after them, because the thing everybody gets wrong about Adriano is not what he lost. It is what he chose. And the last chapter of this, a night at the Maracanã in December of 2024, is not the ending anybody predicted. But it starts on a hill, with a man who had a bullet in his head. Vila Cruzeiro in the 1980s was not a metaphor. It was one of the most heavily armed neighborhoods in Rio, controlled by the Comando Vermelho, and it was where Adriano learned to play football barefoot in the alleys, with boys who would later go to prison, and boys who would later be killed. He stayed friends with all of them. Remember that, because it becomes important. His father kept him out of it. Almir had almost nothing, but what he had, he spent on getting his son to a youth club. And once Adriano arrived at one, the problem solved itself, because he did not look like the other children. He was bigger, he was faster, and he hit a football harder than adults did. In 1999, at 17, he signed his first professional contract with Flamengo. Brazilians watched him for about a season and a half and started saying the thing that would follow him for the rest of his career. He reminds us of Ronaldo. That comparison was not lazy. The two were built the same way, they moved the same way, and they had the same ugly, brilliant habit of scoring from positions where no shot should exist. So, when Inter Milan signed Adriano in 2001, it meant something specific. Ronaldo was still at Inter. The 19-year-old was going to train every day with the man he was being compared to. Adriano has said Ronaldo taught him how to read the game and how to handle a crowd, and that Ronaldo's personality was the reason Italy stopped feeling foreign to him. But Inter were stacked, and a 19-year-old was not going to displace anybody. 1 goal in 8 appearances. So Inter loaned him out. At Fiorentina, he scored 6 in 15. Then Parma came for him. And this is the detail that tells you how the sport rated him at 20. Parma agreed to send Fabio Cannavaro to Inter in exchange. Cannavaro was already one of the best defenders on earth and would win the Ballon d'Or 4 years later. Parma traded him for a Brazilian kid who had scored 6 league goals in his life. Parma were right. Adriano scored 23 goals in 37 games for them. In the opening stretch of the 2003 season, he scored 8 in 9, and Inter, who still owned half of him, bought him back before anybody else could. Ronaldo had already gone to Real Madrid. The number 9 shirt and the whole weight of the club were now sitting on a 21-year-old from Vila Cruzeiro, and he did not blink. 12 goals in 18 appearances in his first half-season back. Then, 28 goals in 42 appearances across all competitions the next year. Inter tore up his contract and gave him a new one worth around 24 million euros. The Italian press gave him the name, L'Imperatore. Defenders in Serie A, the hardest league in the world at that time, the league of Nesta and Maldini and Cannavaro himself, talked about him the way you talk about weather. Understand what that meant in practice. This was a center forward built like a heavyweight who could also run, and who hit a football with his left foot at a speed that turned good goalkeepers into spectators. Defenders could not out-muscle him and could out out-sprint him, so the only tactic left was to foul him early and hope he lost interest. Inter had spent years looking for a replacement for Ronaldo, and had found something that was arguably harder to play against. And then, in July of 2004, he went to Peru with Brazil and had the single greatest month of his career. Lima, the 25th of July, 2004, Copa América final, Brazil against Argentina, and Argentina were winning it with the clock in stoppage time. Adriano received the ball with his back to goal, turned, and hit it. Brazil equalized in the 93rd minute. The match went to penalties, and Adriano took the first one, the one that sets the tone for everybody behind you, and scored it. Brazil won the tournament. He finished that Copa América with 7 goals. He was top scorer and player of the tournament, and nobody had scored 7 in a single edition of the competition since 1959, when the man who did it was Pelé. What he said afterwards is on record, and he was crying when he said it. He said the title belonged to his father. He called Almir his great friend in life, his partner. He said that without him, he was nothing. 9 days later, Almir Leite Ribeiro died of a heart attack. He was 45 years old. Javier Zanetti was in the building when Adriano found out. Zanetti's account has not changed in 20 years. Adriano took a call from Brazil, threw the phone down, and started screaming. Zanetti says he still gets goosebumps describing it. He and the Inter chairman Massimo Moratti agreed between themselves that from that day they would treat Adriano like family. Now, and this is the part that makes the story genuinely strange, Adriano did not stop playing well. He got better, briefly. He played angry. He scored, and he pointed at the sky, and he scored again. If you were reading the results page, you would have seen a striker entering his prime. 11 months after burying his father, Adriano went to the Confederations Cup in Germany and won it almost by himself. 5 goals in the tournament, 2 of them in the final, a 4-1 win over Argentina. He took the Golden Shoe as top scorer and the Golden Ball as the best player in the competition, both in the same week, which is something Ronaldinho and Thierry Henry have done, and almost nobody else has. That is the last time Adriano Leite Ribeiro was the best footballer at a tournament. He was 23. Zanetti has the sentence for it. He kept playing, he kept scoring, he kept dedicating them to his father. But after that phone call, nothing was the same again. The next detail is worth the like and the subscribe on its own, because it is the part almost nobody knows. By the following season, Adriano was drinking every night. His own words, from an interview years later. He only felt happy when he drank. He could only sleep when he drank. And he was so afraid of turning up late to training that he stopped sleeping altogether and went in drunk instead. Roberto Mancini noticed. His teammates noticed. And Inter sent him to lie down in the medical department and told Italian journalists that their striker had a muscle problem. That is a European giant covering for a 23-year-old every week and calling it a hamstring. Ivan Cordoba spent a night trying to reach him. Cordoba told him he was a mixture of Ronaldo and Ibrahimovic, and asked whether Adriano understood that he could become the best player who ever lived. Zanetti's summary of that entire period is 4 words long: "We never succeeded." Not everybody accepts that framing. One reading of these years is medical: grief that became depression, depression that became alcoholism, inside a football culture in 2005 that had no vocabulary for any of it and reached for the word indiscipline instead. The other reading is simpler and harsher. A very rich young man with no supervision chose the parties, and the illness is a story built afterwards to explain it. Zanetti, who saw him every day, says depression. A large part of the Brazilian press has never said it once. You have the same facts they do. Then came the World Cup he was supposed to own. Germany, 2006. Brazil went as favorites with Ronaldinho and Kaká and Adriano scored twice, against Australia and against Ghana. And then in the quarterfinal against France, he barely touched the ball. Brazil went out. Adriano was 24 years old, and he had just played the last World Cup match of his life. Inter tried everything, including doing nothing. In 2008, Maratti stopped fining him and put him on unpaid leave instead. Go home to Brazil, get well, come back when you can. Adriano trained with Sao Paulo, joined them on loan, scored twice on his debut, and the queue for his replica shirt went around the block. Then he was sent off for a headbutt, fined for turning up late, and had a public row with a photographer. He was back in Italy before the season ended. But 2009 is the year that ruins the simple version of this story. Adriano went to Flamengo, his first club, the one that signed him at 17, and scored 19 goals as Flamengo won the Brazilian championship for the first time in 17 years. Overweight, drinking, depressed, still the most dangerous forward in the country. Roma believed the numbers and brought him back to Europe. 7 months, 8 appearances, gone. Corinthians signed him in 2011, and he ruptured his Achilles almost immediately. And in November of that year, back from 6 months out, he came off the bench against Atlético Mineiro. Stoppage time again. He let the ball run so far towards the goal line that the angle was practically closed, and then he hit it with his left foot off the far post and in. Corinthians were champions 2 weeks later. That was the last important thing Adriano did on a football pitch, and it happened at 29. Here is where almost every video about Adriano lies to you. You have seen the thumbnails, the ones that tell you the emperor lost everything and lives in poverty in the favela. He does not. He lives in Barra da Tijuca, an expensive part of West Rio, and he has money. What he does is go back to Vila Cruzeiro to see the people he grew up with, on a scooter, handing things out to kids. And the journalists who have followed him for 20 years all report the same observation. That is when he looks happiest. That is the actual story, and it is a harder one to sell than poverty. Not a man who lost a fortune, a man who was handed the biggest life football can offer. Milan, 24 million euros, the number 9 at Inter, and who kept walking back towards the hill, over and over, until the walking back became the whole life. He was never trying to escape Vila Cruzeiro. Escaping it was his father's plan for him. It was never his. Tiche, who managed him at Corinthians, calls him one of the great frustrations of his coaching career. Not because Adriano wasted talent, but because Tiche could not reach him. Adriano's own line, from 2017, is the one that stays. He says he has never hurt anyone. He says the only person he has hurt is himself. And then, on the 15th of December 2024, 21,000 people came to the Maracanã for a testimonial called The Emperor's Last Battle. Flamengo legends against friends from Italy. Adriano was 42, and he scored twice, and the second one was a penalty that won the game. At halftime, they stopped the match and played him a video. It was a message from his father. the voice rebuilt with artificial intelligence 20 years after the phone call in Milan. Almir speaking to him in a full stadium. He could not stand up straight. Carlos Alberto Pereira said this man would play in 3 more World Cups. He played in 1. In February of 2026, he turned 44, and a film studio in Brazil began developing his life story for the cinema. The rise, the 9 days, and everything after. 21,000 people did not fill the Maracanã for a striker. They filled it for a son.